What's up? This is a video about how to keep objects and when you transfer from one scene to another scene. This is a re-recording, better quality, hopefully louder and easier to understand. Um, all you with the new scene manager system, all you really do is you create a scene. Right here I have a scene called Never Unload, and what you put whatever you want to keep in that scene uh, the entire game, and you never unload it, because with the scene manager you can load and unload scenes whenever. This is better than DontDestroyOnLoad because you're not transferring data from one scene to another. You're not creating instantiations, and there won't ever be any duplicates. When you're using Don't Destroy and you go to a previous scene, you always have to search through every single object in the entire scene to see if it's a duplicate, and if it is, then you have to delete it. That's a ton of work that isn't necessary. Um, so I'm just going to show you how it works. It's what they talk about in the API. They say to do it with the additive scene loading. So that's where I got this technique from. So I have three scenes. The first one is just an empty scene with the player, camera. I have a light, it's not necessary, and then just any manager scripts, whatever. I just have this one empty game object. And then we have two more scenes. The first scene, scene 1, is just a plane. Scene 2 is another plane. Okay? So, when you're in the editor, you can load two scenes at once. So let's say we go to scene 1, you can right click it and just go to open scene additive. Then you can see where to put the player. And then you just right click it and go to remove. So you know where to put the player. Alright, so the first thing that happens is when we have this AnyManager empty game object that has an AnyManager script, and it's a static script, which means it can be accessed by any other script anywhere. So it's public static, AnyManager type, AnyManager variable. You can name this anything, AnyManager, you can name it that. I'm just going to name it AnyManager with the lowercase a, and then in awake we set that variable to this script. So we can access this script anywhere from any scene. And then I'm just using a bool that's false that I set to true as soon as this happens one time on awake, just in case awake is called again when other scenes are loaded. I'm not sure if it is, but if it is, this will only happen once right when the game starts. Okay? And what this does is it loads the very first scene of the game. One line of code, okay? The scene manager. In order to use the scene manager, you have to use Unity Engine, scene management, up there, and then it's just one line of code. Scene manager, load scene async. Async means it loads in the background. You'll see it happens really quickly though. And you don't want to use just regular load scene because it'll unload the previous scene. We want control when to unload the previous scene. And then you just select whatever integer the scene is from the build settings. So go to File, make sure you add open scenes one at a time. You can move them around if they're not in order, I recently discovered. But these integers on the right side are the integers that they are the indexes of them in the array. So the first scene is 0, and then scene 1 is 1, scene 2 is 2, coincidentally. So yeah, 1 is going to be the scene 1, alright? And then we just make sure it's additive. That means it adds it to the scene instead of the other one. And that's it that you need to know right now, just on the awake function. So as soon as you press play, it'll load the next scene. Okay, and you'll see there's two scenes loaded now. There's the never unload scene that has the player and anything else, score manager, whatever, and then you have scene 1 that is just the next scene with all the items in it. Alright, so let's take a look at that scene. It's just a quad, and it has a load empty game object that's just a trigger that just has the load script, and it has a variable, it's public, that is what scene it's going to load when the player moves into that trigger. Okay, scene 2, right? Let's see what that does. Load, really basic. There's the scene variable that's public, and it has a bool to make sure that this occurs only once, right? Because you don't want to keep loading additive scenes. It will load additive scenes constantly. So you just set the bool to true so it doesn't do it again. And then simply scene management up here. You go to scene manager, load scene async, the exact same thing, right? You select whatever scene it is, and then you load it additively. Really simple, right? So let's go back to the very first one. It's going to load the first scene. When we go into the trigger, it's going to load the next scene. There you go. So now you'll see both scenes are loaded. Scene 1, Scene 2, and the very original. So now we just unload the one we don't need. We unload the first scene. And in order to do that, we'll go to Scene 2. Once this one's loaded, it has another trigger. When the player goes to that trigger, it'll unload. It has basically the same empty game object. Put in the scene 1, because that's the previous one. Let's take a look at unload. Same thing, super simple. It's basically the same thing. It's slightly different. It has the bool that on trigger enter, it'll do it once. I put unload first to make sure it sets that bool before it unloads the scene. But you can't just go to scene manager and then unload the scene, because it'll freeze Unity, because I'm guessing this script is still running or something, and you can't just unload it. It gets caught in a loop or whatever, and it freezes Unity. So this is my AnyManager script that's static. That's why we made this static, so we can access it anywhere. So I'm accessing that AnyManager script, the AnyManager variable of that script, that's this, whatever you named it, and then I'm doing the unload scene, which is a custom method that I wrote in that script. Right here, unload scene. It takes in a scene number, whatever the index is of the scene, that you send it to it. So that's pretty basic. And then this has an extra step, because still, if you unload the scene within this method, it's still occurring with in the same frame, and it'll still freeze the game. So I just use a coroutine. This is a coroutine. You just type IEnumerator, and a coroutine just needs a yield. There's different types of yield that just yields for different amounts of time before continuing. Just like a pause. So I just start coroutine, unload, and send it the variable. Alright, and then so immediately I just say yield return null. That just means you wait till the end of the frame and then continue. So it'll wait till the end of the frame, and then it'll unload the scene, and then it won't freeze. And to unload the scene, very simple, one line of code. You need your scene manager up top, and then scene manager, unload scene, whatever scene it is. And that's it. That's pretty much all there is to it. So press play. We'll enter the first trigger, it'll load the second scene, and then it'll unload the first when we enter the second trigger. And that's it. And then the first scene is where the player and the camera are, where the AnyManager script is, where your score manager is, where your lighting map manager is, whatever you need. You keep it in that one scene. It doesn't cost anything to run that extra scene. You're not transferring any data anywhere. You're not running through an array of every object in the scene to see if there's any duplicates. It is much more optimized than using DontDestroyOnLoad. And you have a lot more control, because you can load and unload scenes whenever. So you can see there's no pause, obviously. If there's a bigger scene, it might take longer to load. Theoretically, you can do this and have your game go on forever. Or if there's a door and you have to wait till the door animation plays, you can choose when to load and unload scenes. Or maybe the player goes through a tunnel, and on the other side of the tunnel there's another loaded scene. But then the player decides to turn around and go back to the previous scene. Well, you don't have to load and unload constantly. You just, wherever the player's moving, you just put triggers and decide that's where you load and unload the scenes. You just have to make sure you unload scenes in an IEnumerator that waits till the end of the frame if the unload function is in the same script. that it's being called. And another cool reason that this is really kind of easy to use and kind of optimized is because, say you're in the first scene and you go to the second one and there's a doorway and the door opens and there's an enemy in the next scene, and they shoot a fireball from scene 2 to scene 1. Well, that fireball you can instantiate in the never unload scene. You don't need to instantiate it in either one of these two scenes. You instantiate it in the never unload scene, and then it just travels from scene to scene, and even if one, deletes or whatever, it doesn't matter, the fireball will still exist, and it just makes it convenient for traversing from one scene to another. So this is, I already recorded this once. Hopefully I didn't forget anything that I recorded the first time, and hopefully it's easier to understand. I changed the volume and recorded it at a higher resolution with the bigger text on the scripts, and you can see, hopefully, oh, that's another script. Yeah, it's actually pretty easy to use the scene manager. It's just really one line of code. It just matters where you put it and how you use it, and yeah, easy peasy. Alright, thank you. Have a good one.